Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this event presented in the American Inspiration Author Series. It's great to have you with us tonight in the land of history, looking at our government's records, the intention, execution, and impact, particularly of the 1940 US Census. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event featuring Professor Dan Bouk and his just-released book, Democracy's Data, The Hidden Stories of the US Census and How to Read Them. After an extended illustrated talk, Dan will address your questions and a few of mine. Before we get started, some quick reminders and an introduction. We are in a Zoom webinar format, which means that your microphone is muted and your video is off. We can't take your comments in the chat box, but do look there for relevant information and helpful links. We asked for your questions as you registered. We got some great questions. If you have additional queries, enter them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen on the right. A video of the program will be shared with all who registered. The link will be emailed when it's available in the hours or day ahead, and you are welcome to share that link with friends and fellow researchers. Of course, the real education and insight comes from reading Democracy's Data, Dan's book, which has been glowingly reviewed in many publications, from Wired Magazine to the Washington Post, which said, "In the hands of someone who understands us, the census is a mirror of the country's ideals, values, flaws, and attributes." So yes, the census is the stuff of American history writ large. A review in this week's New York Times called the book ruminative and rich. It makes the dull old census a feast for the senses. Copies of Democracy's Data can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Mass. Use the code AMINS22 as you order, and the book you will receive will be signed by the author on a bookplate. You'll see more information in the chat, and also it will be emailed to you with the video link. Now for an introduction, and I must say, this is one of my favorite introductions ever. Dan Bouk researches the history of bureaucracies, quantification, and other modern things shrouded in cloaks of boringness. He studied computational mathematics as an undergraduate before earning a PhD in history from Princeton University. His first book, How Our Days Became Numbered, explored the life insurance industry's method for quantifying people, discriminating by race, and thinking statistically. Dan teaches history at Colgate University. Welcome, Dan. We can't wait to hear from you about this remarkable book. It's a wonderful mix of facts and stories and American history. And I must say, it's really great to have you with us on a topic that is near and dear to so many of us on the Zoom call tonight, researchers that we are. And this is evidenced by the large crowd that you have gathered today. Dan, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for that introduction and for inviting me here tonight. Thanks too to Courtney Reardon, who is behind the scenes making this presentation happen, and to Steve Weil at FSG, who helped to organize this lecture. So I'm speaking to you all today tonight, I suppose, from Hamilton, New York, on the campus of Colgate University, which is bustling with the dreams, the ideas, the creativity of our recently arrived students. Colgate is situated in the indigenous homelands of the Oneida Indian people, and I'd like to pay respect to Oneida people, past, present, and future, and honor their continuing presence in this homeland, as well as throughout the Haudenosaunee diaspora. And I also want to thank each and every one of you for joining me here tonight. All right, let me get my slides running so that you can see these images I've come to share. Let's see if we get this to work. All right, and there we go. I believe many of you in the audience today are very familiar with images like this one. This is a census record from 1940. When I began writing Democracy's Data, the 1940 records were the most recent materials available from a federal census. In April of this year, so just a few months ago, that changed, as again I'm sure many of you are aware, and now a whole new world of mysteries and revelations awaits in the 1950 census records. For today, though, I will stay mostly planted in 1940 to tell the story of these census records. Now yes, you heard that right. I will be telling the story of these records. That's not the ordinary way of doing things, I will grant you that. For those of you and us who research the histories of our families or communities or some other entity, like the nation, these records are a means, not an ends. They are not an end. They reveal to you some clues or even facts about those you seek to better understand. Tonight, I ask you to try out a different approach to thinking about the census. Join me in an investigation of the census as a knowledge-making process, a vast, continent-spanning process, in fact, one intended to generate reliable, stable, and legitimate facts that Americans and their government could use to live, plan, and govern. So while I will present a number of individual stories, and we'll look closely at some records, we will mostly be concerned with the bigger picture, the larger social, political, and technical process that generated census records. As we look at census records this evening, we will consider them as byproducts of that knowledge-making enterprise. In a way, you could say they're like the waste products, the waste left behind by America's factory of facts. Yet we know that they are so much more than that. They are valuable today for glimpses they give us into the past lives and households and neighborhoods of people who are dear to us or places that are dear to us. And as I will show you tonight, even during the 1940 census, the meaning and the uses of these census records changed. I will tell you a story about 1940 census records, which turns out to raise big and enduring questions about what we owe each other and what government owes each of us, about the limits to privacy and the sources of identity, and at its most fundamental level, about what it means to be a whole person, a complex, multifaceted individual in a sprawling, diverse democracy. In preparation for the 1940 count, the Census Bureau urged people to cooperate. Indeed, rather incredibly, I think, to our ears, cooperate, just cooperate, was one actual slogan. Consider the iconography here, with an Uncle Sam figure filling in names on a scroll, making a list of every American. When a human enumerator came to the door, he or she, most likely he, but just barely in 1940. Anyways, when he or she came to the door, that enumerator came in the name of Uncle Sam, in the name of the nation. To know America, the Census Bureau explained, tell America. And America would appear on your doorstep in the guise of a neighbor, one selected via a series of tests and with the approval of members of Congress from the party in power. The Bureau had another turn of phrase that made a similar point, but I think with more poetry. Quote, "You cannot know your country unless your country knows you." So this was the bargain. Reveal your personal information, and in return, you and your community and your state and your country can better know itself and govern itself. If we look back to this census sheet that I began with, we should recall that it is a digitization of a microfilmed photograph of a large paper form. This staged photograph with the film star Tyrone Power and an enumerator gives a sense of the actual size of one of these sheets. The enumerator received a whole sheaf of these papers, along with a large leather portfolio that made it easy to carry them around and then also easy to ship them back to the central office. The papers were ready to be filled in, but they were not blank. They already bore markings from the Bureau, questions, categories, instructions, many of which had been decided in a special conference held early in March in 1939. One of the people in attendance at that conference was Margaret Scattergood, identified here on a census sheet as a researcher for a labor union. She was in fact a researcher for the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, which she would later describe as meaning that she did for the nation's unions what the CIA did for the national government. The AFL's president, William Green, sent Scattergood in his stead to represent their interests. She was joined as well by two representatives from the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, which represented the mass of everyday workers, those outside the traditional trades. Scattergood probably commuted to D.C. that morning from her home, a large, elegant house in the Virginia countryside. She would have arrived by 10 a.m., if everything went according to plan, at a massive, monumental building, the product of 60,000 tons of Indiana limestone and Connecticut granite, roofed by 6 acres of terracotta tiles. When the Commerce Department building first opened its doors in 1932, I love this, the Washington Post headline read, "Size of building baffles writers." 7 years later, Scattergood would have passed through the large Greek columns that greeted her and moved into the Commerce Department auditorium to find the rest of those called to this special conference. Scattergood was quite well off, but she was not rich, certainly not so rich as the rest of the men, and they were almost exclusively men, who convened that day to determine the 1940 census questions. I can say that about the wealth of these men because they were asked a question about their income by census takers, and almost every single one that I was able to find, I couldn't find them all here, reported making $5,000 or more, which was an imprecision allowed to the wealthy to save them the embarrassment of admitting to their neighbors their true income. Scattergood, for her part, earned a handsome sum of $4,000 a year. Compared to most Americans, that made her very comfortable. That was in the top 2.5% of all Americans and the top 1% for women. In fact, the average income at that time was probably around maybe a little bit above $1,000 a year. Scattergood is listed as white in the census, as were all of the other attendees at this conference. The director of the census at the time, William Lane Austin, had raised the possibility of including on the Population Census Advisory Board a single African-American representative, the president of Tuskegee Institute, Dr. Frederick Douglass Patterson, but Austin and his superiors deemed it, quote, not essential at this time. As these data portraits illustrate, the auditorium on that March 1939 day was filled by Census Bureau staff and also by officials representing the growing ABCs of the government, the agencies like the Veterans, the administrations like the Veterans Administration or the Social Security Board or the Tariff Commission. Titans of business attended and made their marks, as did the professional brains from the worlds of academia and philanthropy. And of course, there was Margaret Scattergood and her ilk. These folks set the priorities for the nation's count. Questions about immigration and national origin had dominated census sheets, taking up much of the space since the late 19th century. But anti-immigration laws, many of which that were kind of fueled by debates that drew on census figures, substantially decreased migration to the United States between 1870 and 1930, and the question men who gathered in 1939 had new, different priorities. The businessmen worried more about identifying sources of demand, and labor too worried about getting firm figures on purchasing power of their members. A census official called the 1940 census a inventory of democracy. And indeed, it had a much greater economic bent than earlier censuses, reflecting the realities of the Depression and the way that Roosevelt's New Deal had invested heavily in the idea that government, working with organized labor and big business, had a responsibility to improve the economic lives of Americans, which was a kind of new idea. The priorities of these groups of the question men took shape as pre-printed on a pre-printed blank form, almost half of which was now devoted to economic topics, as is here indicated by that blue mass. You cannot know your country unless your country knows you. To know America, tell America. The people who were in that room decided what individuals had to tell, and thus what way the United States could be known. Now, you may have noticed something about Margaret Scattergood's census record. In the column for relation, Scattergood is listed as partner. Florence Thorne, with whom she worked and with whom she shared her home, appears in the record as head of household, and May Stotts Allen is listed as the maid to Thorne, defined by a servile status. In early 2020, 2 reporters from the Washington Post investigated Thorne and Scattergood's story because their house had been repurposed. It now served, and I think probably still serves, as the Scattergood-Thorne Conference Center on the campus of the CIA, its Langley headquarters. The reporters Jessica Contreras and Gillian Brockle reported that the partner label in the 1940 census reported on this label, and they pondered its meanings. Did it imply romantic or intimate attachment, the way the term so often does these days? Or did it have other connotations? They interviewed some surviving relatives who did not believe that the two were romantically involved. Of course, it might have been a well-kept secret from a time when lesbian relationships were frequently taboo. There is no evidence that that was true. Still, I do call this a queer household, because queer denotes a way of living that transgresses the norms of a straight family, which in America looked like a male head of household, a female wife, and possibly children. The partner label made it possible to count people who did not live in such normal families, which is to say straight patriarchal families, the kind that the question men in DC had planned for, had built the census to count. The theorist of nationalism, Benedict Anderson, writes, quote, "The fiction of the census is that everyone is in it, that everyone has one, and only one, extremely clear place. Partners, like Margaret Scattergood, were folks who didn't have an extremely clear place." Looking at the entire manuscript census for the 48 states in 1940, through a database maintained by IPMS USA, it became clear to me that partners came in clumps in the US Census. Here's a data visualization prepared for me by the data scientist Stephanie Jordan. The bigger the circles, the larger the number of partners enumerated, and then the shading indicates what percentage of the population showed up as a partner. At the national level in 1940, partners were rare. They were less than 1% of the number of spouses, which at this point meant effectively wives, and only about 0.15% of the total population. Yet, as this map shows, in some places up to 6 or 7% of all people enumerated could be partners. Supposing that we say, paraphrasing Tolstoy, that every normal household is the same, every peculiar one is peculiar in its own peculiar way. In New York's Greenwich Village, partners tended to be unmarried individuals living with a person of the same sex, like Margaret Scattergood. In Harlem, by contrast, the typical partner was married, just not to the person they live with. Many of these individuals had moved north as part of the Great Migration of African Americans, separating them by choice or by necessity from a spouse. On Manhattan's Upper East Side, partners were also likely to be migrants, not from the US South, but from Europe. If we were to look at partners in San Francisco, we find that they vary too, from neighborhood to neighborhood. One of the hottest spots for finding partners was in the larger American empire, in this case in the territory of Hawaii, which was not yet a state, where census enumerators found themselves trying to count the workers who made the future state's vast plantations work. Partners in Hawaii were particularly likely to be Filipino men doing the hardest plantation tasks and living in groups in work camps. This group of partners here that you're looking at, in contrast, worked on a Works Progress Administration road repair gang. It included a divorced Puerto Rican, a widowed black man from Kentucky, a widowed Puerto Rican, and a white Canadian, all living in one household, and living beside Chinese, Native Hawaiian, Mexican, and Filipino workers. You won't find evidence of these partners as partners in the final printed census results, though. After all the census sheets returned to Washington, D.C., a team of editors, possibly in a room resembling this one, coded every partner with the same code, the same one used for lodgers or for roommates. And then another worker, like this woman, punched each partner's info into a card and transformed each partner into a lodger. So why bother in the first place? Well, the partner label gave some people, some communities, some enumerators, a way to make sense of a person, to make them fit into a household in a way that that person, that enumerator, that community could understand. But once that was done, the Census Bureau's editors, card punchers, and tabulators no longer needed or wanted the partner label. To know America, it was useful to tell America, I'm a partner. But that never became part of the larger story of the nation. Until now. So, the partner label was officially sanctioned, even if not exactly encouraged for use in the field. But a close study of census sheets reveals, and I think this won't be a surprise to many of you who've spent some time in census sheets, it reveals that people, the counters, and the counted often colored outside the prescribed lines. These documents reveal to those who know where to look for it, sweeping conflict, even in some cases, international intrigue. So, consider these sheets filled out in a neighborhood of Houston, Texas by enumerator Anne G. Robinson. One day in early May 1940, after weeks of enumerating, Robinson passed into a new section of town. It says here ends Kashmere Gardens, begins Englewood. In Kashmere Gardens, Robinson had filled out the race category with almost all W's, meaning she deemed the inhabitants to be white. In Englewood, the first person she spoke with was Mary Sheffield, whom Robinson classified as Negro, the official census term for African Americans. She also began writing repeatedly MEX, as in this record with the Diaz family. Perhaps the Diazes thought of themselves as racially Mexican. Or, maybe, in the Jim Crow South, where segregation was legally enforced and deadly serious, Robinson could not fathom that these people standing before her, with Mexican roots living in a mixed-race neighborhood, could be white. But according to the Census Bureau, officially, they were white. In 1930, the Bureau had briefly instituted a Mexican racial category. The move had terrifying consequences at a moment when, in the throes of the Great Depression, the United States deported thousands of Mexicans and Mexican Americans and agreed with Mexico to send south hundreds of thousands of Mexican Americans, many of whom were citizens of the United States, in what was called a repatriation program. In this context, by 1935, it looked as though the census racial categorization might cause a cascade of legal and bureaucratic consequences, cementing a distinct Mexican race and justifying the erosion of Mexican Americans' rights and claims to full citizenship. In that context, local advocates sought help across the border. The Mexican government agreed to step in, insisting that the United States remove the Mexican racial label. Henceforth, Mexican Americans would be white. That meant Robinson's racial labels could not stand. An editor in D.C., as we can see here if you look really closely, put a line through each MEX and instead wrote 1, which was the code for white, the 1940 census's default race. In the published figures, no racial Mexicans appeared, which was a crucial victory for many Mexican Americans in the United States, in a moment before the great changes wrought by the Civil Rights Movement, which made it possible for the visibility of non-white racial groups to lead to better representation and greater political influence. The fight over the Mexican racial category lingers, though. Right? It wasn't published at the time, but it lingers on these pieces of paper, where individuals were supposed to tell America, so America might be known. It was the income question chosen by Scattergood and the Question Men that led to a very public census fight in 1940, which was not coincidentally a presidential election year. A Republican senator from New Hampshire saw an opportunity to take a crack at Roosevelt and also to undermine his vision for a more interventionist government, one that needed to know precisely the wage income of every American. We can read possible traces of the ensuing fight in the manuscript census, again, if we know where to look. So right now, you see before you census records left behind by Ray and Florence Dowd from Indiana. They indicate that Ray worked as a barber and Florence as a grocery clerk. On the far right-hand side, you see that the couple reported working a total of 60 hours a week, but in the prior year had earned $0 in wages. Now, that could be true if each claimed to be self-employed, working in census parlance on their own account, but that designation is missing here. And the reason I looked at this couple's records in the first place was that Florence sent this drawing to the New Hampshire senator fuming about a snooping census. Before a census enumerator ever appeared at her door, Florence imagined her response. She did not think of the census taker as Uncle Sam, come to help her understand her country. She saw him as a peeper. And she had a pair of brass toes, which was not something I had heard of before. I expect one of the questions in the Q&A to become, what are brass toes? And I will say, I do not know. Perfectly suited for kicking the census taker right in the rear. The census sheets make no mention of metal footwear, and they bear no trace of physical violence. But those zeros seem newly suspicious. They look like a form of resistance, like an assertion of privacy. And similar suspicious zeros show up all over the 1940 Census Record. As the Census Bureau pressed individuals to give up more sensitive information, such as concerning their income, it emphasized a relatively new pledge to keep individual answers confidential. It further insisted that no census responses could be used to harm an individual, that census responses could not be used to determine how much a tax a person had to pay, for instance, or whether to send an individual to war. The census would only generate aggregate figures. To know America statistically, tell America confidentially. The war in Europe and Asia, already a world war in 1939, put new pressures on the Census Bureau and made those promises and that idea of the Bureau's mission much harder to maintain. After the war, a Census Bureau official named Iwao Moriyama, a Japanese-American vital statistician with a PhD from Yale, would look back and explain that, quote, "The most essential commodity for the prosecution of the war was people. People to fight the war, people to produce war material, and people to whom critical material had to be diverted for the production of essential civilian goods. The government, therefore, needed accurate and up-to-date statistics about the population to win the war." It turned out, however, that the government also needed, or desired, a great many details about small groups or individuals. As war loomed in 1941, the drive to mobilize American resources to fight instigated a temporary transformation at the Census Bureau. For the next few years, the Bureau would churn out personal data alongside facts about the nation. In May 1940, President Roosevelt called on American factories to serve as, quote, "the great arsenal of democracy." But he and his administration worried about sabotage or spies, and so required that all defense workers be U.S. citizens. But how could a person prove citizenship? This at a moment when it was still far from certain that most adults would have birth certificates, and when Social Security cards were barely 3 years old. The census came to serve as a trusted source for certifications of both age and citizenship. Moriyama worried about the entire operation, that it might buckle under the strain. He wrote later, quote, "The unprecedented load imposed upon the vital statistics registration system threatened to break down the system completely. The Bureau faced hundreds of thousands of requests for proofs of age and citizenship, taxing its capacities. at a moment when it was supposed to be completing the 1940 census and tabulating all of that material. To get a war job, tell America. That was not the census slogan in 1941, or it's the census slogan, but in 1941, it would have been appropriate. On December 8th, 1941, the United States declared war on Japan. Moriyama, whose parents had been born in Japan and whose brother lived there, remained a devoted bureau officer. He served throughout the war. He was far from alone. Tens of thousands of Japanese Americans fought in the European theater with the segregated 442nd Regimental Combat Team, one of the war's most decorated combat units, and thousands more served in military intelligence in the Pacific Theater. But in 1942, the Roosevelt administration, acting without any reliable information, decided the Japanese and Japanese Americans constituted a threat to national security and would be forcibly removed from the West Coast. Those who had no other place to go were placed in concentration camps. Moriyama's parents narrowly escaped that fate. They lost everything they had in San Francisco, but they received permission to relocate to Washington, D.C., where they lived with their son in his lodging house room, subject to close surveillance. Moriyama's colleagues in the Census Bureau directly aided the Japanese evacuation and incarceration. Striving to stay relevant and act patriotically, Bureau officials offered to turn their statistical capacities to whatever war aims they could, including generating special tabulations showing the small areas where people lived who had been labeled Japanese by race. Those were, as far as we can tell, all statistical aggregates, although for small groups and areas. Here you can see a report that they produced, in which case each of those little dots that form the kind of groups represent only 10 people. With the passage of the Second War Powers Act in March 1942, it became legal for the Census Bureau to share individual information, individual data, with war agencies as well. The Bureau broke its pledge to confidentiality in 1943, which it could now legally do, and released to the FBI a list of Japanese Americans living in Washington, D.C., according to the 1940 census. The researchers Margot Anderson and William Seltzer discovered this list in 2007, and they noted an oddity in it. One of the people listed seemed to have been a late addition. He was placed on the list at number 65 and a half, and he worked for the Census Bureau. His name was Iwao Moriyama. Anderson and Seltzer speculated at the time that Moriyama had been spared at first by his Bureau colleagues. They were working without the benefit of the manuscript census, though, which would not be released to them for 5 more years. When I consulted it while writing this book, I realized there was a different reason for Moriyama's initial absence. Here again is Moriyama's census record, showing his enumeration in a lodging house packed with government workers. The enumerator, working in segregated Washington, D.C., must have decided that Moriyama, living amongst people classified as white, should also be noted down as white. Indeed, this made sense. In the segregated Census Bureau offices, Moriyama worked with white colleagues and played on the white softball team. As a result, when the Bureau tabulated all people classified as Japanese by race in D.C., the printouts did not include Moriyama. One of his colleagues in the Bureau must have caught the omission and added him later. In 1947, the Second War Powers Act was repealed, affirming once again the confidentiality of U.S. census records. In 2000, the Census Bureau's director apologized for its role in aiding the removal of Japanese Americans. And the Bureau has over the decades developed new policies and review boards to prevent the release of tabulations that might be used against vulnerable groups. The story remains important, though, if for no other reason as a reminder to the keepers of our data of the harm that weaponized records can be turned to unless we, are vigilant. Before the war came, the Bureau did manage to publish its most important statistical table. The reason the founders called the census into existence was to facilitate the reapportionment of political power amongst states every 10 years. State population totals serve as the basis for deciding how many seats each state has in the House of Representatives and how many votes it has in the Electoral College. For most of the history of the United States, Congress had received these figures and used them to pass a new law, often one that increased the size of the House such that few, or often no, states would lose any seats in the House. That's evident in this graph from usapportionment.org, which is a very good resource, which shows that the practice meant that the House tended to grow with the population, although they grew more slowly. Now that changed in 1920, when House leadership decided that efficiency demanded freezing the House membership at 435 seats, which now feels like a natural number, but in fact at that time just happened to be the number of seats that were occupied. As a result, Congress failed to pass any reapportionment law in 1920 or in the years after. Having realized that it was nearly impossible to pass new legislation apportioning the House at a fixed size, Congress passed a law instead to act as a kind of insurance. It would automatically apportion if Congress failed to act. In 1941, the automatic backup kicked in, apportioning the House automatically for the second time. It had also done that in 1931. But the Democrats in power realized that this apportionment gave a seat to Michigan that might, by using a different and equally valid method, have been handed over to the more solidly Democratic Alabama. So Congress passed a new apportionment law, installing that different method as the new default procedure, it is still today, and incidentally, made all future apportionments entirely automatic. The result is clear from this graph. The House still has only 435 seats, even as the population of the United States has tripled. Democracy has become a game of musical chairs, and each American's grasp on their Congress member has grown more and more tenuous. It was not always like this, and it need not remain so. Congress could expand the House or remove the automatic apportionment system at any time. With a bigger House, it becomes more likely that your country will know you as more than a statistic. I'll close my lecture there and put up this image from the beginning of Democracy's Data. When you open up the book, you'll see this there. It kind of lays out the chapters ahead. To know America, we need to understand its data and how its shared facts are made. Thank you.
Dan, that was so interesting. I really enjoyed it. And you talk about the census being a knowledge-making process. Well, listening to you is also a knowledge-making process. So thank you for taking us along on that. We have a number of great questions that we've gotten in advance and a couple in on the Q&A. Anybody out there, if you have a question, please do put it into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. In the interim, I have a few questions of my own. I would love to hear more about your research process. Where and how do you do your research for the book and other books? Or maybe we should call it a research journey. In the acknowledgements, you mentioned that you got inspired at the National Archive. I see that you were also at the FDR Library in Hyde Park, at Dartmouth College, University of Mississippi, Northwestern, and elsewhere. My question was also echoed by an audience question. How did he analyze, track, and organize the census info? So many of us are researchers in the audience. How do you do what you do? Help us out.
So we might place this on maybe two tracks. One is the journey that involves moving my feet, and the other is the journey that involves building a team. So moving my feet did involve a number of visits to archives. Luckily, I was able to start the project and complete most of that research before the pandemic made access to archival collections much more difficult. I would go to the National Archives. I would stay usually at a hostel because I like hanging out in a place where there's some kind of folks moving around, and then I would walk in every day to the archives. The National Archives building. One of the great secrets and the wonderful things about being a researcher is that if you go to the front entrance, you wait in a long line to get in and see the various exhibits. But if you're a researcher, you go in the back through these beautiful sculptures showing us past and present, thinking about what the past and present are. And we wander through and we get direct access to then this wealth of amazing materials. I carry a camera with me, and I take many, many photographs, and I have an elaborate process for then translating all these things. But so I do that sort of thing. I did that at the National Archives. I did that. I went to, the reason I went to Dartmouth was because that junior senator from New Hampshire, Charles Tobey, was a Dartmouth alum and had deposited his papers there at Dartmouth. So I was able to find, he had claimed on the floor of the House, thousands and thousands of Americans are sending me angry letters about the census. And of course, we hear these complaints all the time, and one assumes that they're made up some substantial portion of the time. Well, it turned out there really were a lot of angry letters in his files. And so there are boxes upon boxes delivered to me. And that's where I, for instance, took pictures there and found Florence Dowd kicking her enumerator in her mind. So those kinds of things happen involving going places. Now, for people who are listening, one useful trick is occasionally it becomes possible to get records without going to archives. So the Truman Library and the University of Mississippi both sent me records that I asked for. I paid for a small fee for them to make copies or make digital copies for me, and then share them with me. So that's how I can find part of the story behind these initial census records. And often then, when I would find someone interesting in the National Archives, in the records of the census, or in the Tobey letters, then I would go and look for them in the census manuscript materials. And that's something I could do using, people might use the federal government's site. Many people, I'm sure, use a commercial site like Ancestry as a way to do that searching and looking for people. I also had the benefit here at Colgate. I had a small group of students who I call my history lab, who I hire, usually 2 or 3 students, and they play a really active role working with me, helping me to then find as many people as possible from these different records that we've gathered. And then we have these wonderful moments talking together about the discoveries as we realize, oh, this person and this person live next to each other and sent these letters together. And you start to put together the pieces of the story by making the archival records speak with the census manuscript records.
Well, those are great tips. Thank you so much. There is so much data in the census. I mean, you call the census building, the Commerce Department, the factory of facts. But in the book, you also talk about, and you referenced it a bit, the silences that are there. And I quote from your book, though the politicians, bureaucrats, scientists, and enumerators seldom talked about it, the census also authored silences. It created statistical holes alongside statistical holes, deciding which Americans would be seen and represented and governed. Can you tell us just a little bit more about these silences, maybe also in other census processes or data back in time? I mean, surely the first census in 1790 was full of silences and holes. I mean, there are probably glaring omissions every 10 years with the census. Tell us about a few of them.
Silences are both really important to pay attention to and also tricky, because I think sometimes there are moments in which we want to and we should ascribe a real value, a negative value, to a silence. So, for instance, when people are not counted in the census, that is an unintentional, in most cases, silence. One of the things that happens in the 1940 census is, after it is completed, there is a study that shows, again, as had been reported by a series of reports from the 1910s and 1920s conducted by African American researchers, that there was a substantial undercount, particularly of African Americans, in the 1940 census. It remains true that the censuses are subject to undercounts. And so those produce a kind of silence, people who don't count, who won't be represented in Congress, people who will be difficult for researchers later to learn about. They were both unintentional and also, I think, bad, clearly bad. It is good to count everybody. Everyone should be counted by the census. That is kind of the point. In terms of people trying to trace their family histories or the histories of their communities, these kinds of silences will be particularly frustrating, because you think, where is this person that I've been looking for? The undercounts were substantial. And so it is quite possible in many cases that people really just did not exist, or not that they existed, but to the US government in the census, they did not necessarily show up on one of these census forms. So that's one kind of silence. But there's another way in which we can't know anything without producing silences. To count one thing means to decide that that thing is important and the other things aren't what we're going to be focused on at any given moment. And so that's why looking at a census sheet can be a reflection or a way of understanding the values of a society at a given moment. When I look at the 1940 census sheet and I see all those economic questions, I realize that means silencing. It means removing all these questions about migration and origins that previously had been really important sources of contention in US politics, and instead drawing attention to a new set of questions. So I guess one thing I would invite people out there as they're doing their own research looking at census records to think about the kind of person that is allowed to be represented, like the way a person is represented in these forms, and to think about how that changes over time, how it is that as you could trace a person, you get to see different aspects or facets of their life that are allowed to become visible because of the changing values of the people designing the questions, the values of the society that produced it.
Excellent. Now turning to your questions, and I see some coming in on the Q&A. Thank you so much. A few from advanced questions, and this is about people who are missing from the census, and many of us have had that experience. Here's a combined question. Over the years, I found a number of people who were counted more than once. This is the other problem in a particular census. Are those anomalies ever repaired? Or are they infrequent and so that doesn't matter? At the same time, other people have been impossible to locate, even when I know from family lore exactly where they were living at the time of the census. I can understand that some adults may have good reasons to hide out and not be counted, but what about a 5-year-old child missing from the 1920 census when all of her siblings were counted? Also someone live in the Q&A, they missed a whole building in Chicago, much to this participant's frustration. How can this happen? Any explanations here, Dan, and do they get corrected?
Well, so there's a couple of different ways to think about corrections here, especially when we're talking about folks who have been counted more than once. There were procedures throughout censuses to try to track down double counting or errors and to disambiguate a person showing up more than once. So it's possible that some of those errors were corrected before the official statistics were produced. In terms of the census manuscript records that now many of us rely on to tell our family stories, there it's a little bit more complicated. And I know, especially as people are looking at the 1950 census records, which hopefully the National Archives has produced a tool to encourage people to transcribe names and also to help fix those names in places. I know there's an urge to want to be able to like put that in one place and have it be fixed throughout all these various systems. And I mean, to some degree, you can't do that. And in part, that's because, well, it might be that a transcription was wrong. Oftentimes, you'll find that people's names were spelled differently than they would have spelled them. They were misspelled either by the enumerator or by someone else in the process. And so those errors are errors. They're misrepresenting a person, but they are a part of this record that ultimately can't be changed. Now, when it comes to people who are missing, as I pointed out, the discovery of undercounts was kind of a story that evolved over the course of the 20th century, largely pushed by African-American scholars, particularly in 1920, and a mathematician at Howard named Kelly Miller. And we came over the course of the 20th century to have now more complex mathematical techniques that allow us to guess, at least, about how many people are actually being missed in each of these folks, or in each of these places. And one of the groups that is significantly undercounted are young children. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but one reason can be that people either don't think a young person counts, or because they think that young person will be counted in another household or by somebody else. Young people can be, the care of people can be distributed within households or families in ways that then they don't get otherwise counted. So to this day, young children ages 5 and under are an undercounted population, and you should definitely tell your neighbors to make sure that their children are counted in the 2030 census.
Okay, turning to some of the questions online, which you brought up. The current census asks many fewer questions than did the censuses of the past. What does this mean for future genealogists, this inconsistency?
And future historians.
Yeah.
We're like, family historians and those of us who are looking at different stories. It's gonna be sad. I am so from 1960, there's still a basically 1950 is the end of the truly long form censuses, and from here on in it'll be less and less information about everybody, and the sample censuses will still exist, and so they will give us for the end of the 20th century a look at about 20% of the population in quite thick detail. But in terms of thinking about like all of these different aspects of an individual life, most of what you'll find about individuals for the 20th century as those records become available every 10 years, right? It takes the Census Bureau keeps these confidential for 72 years and then releases them. Much of that material is going to be much more bare bones information, much more like what you filled out when you filled out a census in 2020. The other reason I'm not entirely sanguine about this is so many now records are being born digital. And while the National Archives is pretty amazing, I am curious to see how it is that they're going to figure out a way to get these digital records to survive for hundreds of years. One of the amazing things about paper is how durable it is. Same thing with microfilm. It's a very durable paper-like substance, and it can just sit around and be legible even to people hundreds of years later. Digital materials are just it's a much trickier problem.
Several folks are asking about the transition to the digital census from the paper census. And can you talk about that transition? When exactly was it, and how horrifying that paper's going away? I love paper.
Yeah, no, me too. I like the paper. This census in 2020 was the first to have wide access to an online census. So I'm using my words very carefully because I believe there might have been tests in 2010 that allowed some people to use an online census, but I'm not entirely sure of that. So many people, it became possible, and the timing was, frankly, perfect, right? The census is there for us to be able to record the history of to be able to see people we care about in the past and to understand history. But its primary purpose is to be able to accurately, hopefully, count every person in their one place and use that to figure out how to represent them, how to accurately distribute and effectively and fairly distribute funds amongst states and communities. And so we want everyone to be counted. And since the 2020 census happened in the midst of a global pandemic, I think it was really useful that we were able to do a lot of that through digital means. And I don't want to be a doomsayer because I'm not in the National Archives doing this, and some really smart people are working on this in the National Archives and all kinds of other settings. This is one thing I'd like to investigate going forward, is try to figure out what kind of plans people have to make digital records persist. Paper, like I say, paper's amazing, and yet the only reason the paper survives so well is because it is also maintained by a vast infrastructure. The National Archives building was built in part as a response to the fact that paper was not being well maintained, and the 1890 census went up in flames. Much of the 1890 census went up in flames because it was being poorly maintained. So even paper requires a vast infrastructure, a lot of government money, and people invested in making sure it's still there a century later.
And what about the transition from the enumerators coming to your door to mail in? That's another question we're getting. Sort of when did that change and happen? I'm surely the spellings got better when people were filling out their own names. I guess enumerators didn't ask, what's your legal name? How do you spell it?
It varied. So it varied very widely in terms, and this is for me the fundamental thing that I guess my favorite thing about looking at a census record. When you're looking at one of these pieces of paper, each line represents a doorstep encounter. It's an enumerator talking to this person on the other side, and sometimes they like each other, sometimes they're at odds with one another for all kinds of reasons, but they have to work out together how this person's going to be reported on this piece of paper. and it requires creativity, all these sorts of things. Now, in the 1950 census records, if you are looking for people in, I want to say Lansing, I think in Michigan, and a couple other Midwestern cities, you'll find some evidence of the first mailback census test runs. You'll see records that don't look like these, or like these records with lots of names, but instead are forms that people have filled out, and they'll show up for whole communities. And so that was in 1950, the Census Bureau was doing some initial tests to think about using a mail census and trying to understand its impacts. And then in 1960, we see a much wider expansion of that. It's important to remember, though, that even after the era of mailback, that came in right in line with the Census Bureau suddenly being much more concerned with actually counting everybody. And so the number of enumerators has actually increased over the course of the 20th century as the Census Bureau sends people out trying to find the people that it otherwise couldn't count, the people who don't enumerate themselves. And as a result of that, we still do, when you look at these records, you're still going to find lots of conversations taking place in the records.
Well, that's good. I'm pro-conversation also, in addition to paper. So one last question here, a bit of a wrap up. You have done this amazing job with the 1940 census. Are you going to turn right now to the 1950 census? Is this a project you'll keep on with your history lab from census to census? Where are you headed?
I mean, at the moment, in terms of census projects, we are still trying to investigate a little bit further why it was that the House of Representatives came to be frozen at 435 seats. So the debates immediately talk about in terms of efficiency, but I suspect that there's more to that story. And so I'm working with some of my history lab students and some other folks to try to get a better sense of how that story works. But I can never give up on the 1950 census or any of these censuses because there's just too many fun stories lurking in there.
Yeah, no, the transition from the 40s to the 50s culturally would be fascinating. All right, we're approaching the end of our time together, but as we do for all our American Inspiration guest authors, we have asked Dan to share some of his words, his work in a closing reading. So Dan, if you will indulge us, back to you from Democracy's Data.
All right. This is Democracy's Data, and this is the epilogue, page 276. A census is so much more than the numbers it reports, as important and as crucial as those numbers are. Every census is a remarkable accomplishment, a glorious dream, and a serious slog. Every census asserts the values of the government and the people that government serves. Every census disseminates to the entire nation a series of acceptable labels and categories, and relies on households to adapt their identities to the census's constraints. Every census affirms in principle the inherent and enduring value of each person residing in the United States, regardless of their status, creed, or circumstance. Every census directs the course of American democracy, distributing dollars and seats for decades to come. For a decade to come. For all these reasons, every census matters and needs to matter to every person committed to building a better, more equitable, more inclusive, and more democratic democracy. Planning for the 2030 census starts right now. It's tempting in the wake of a sentence to sigh, take a breath, and sit back and wait. We can get back to the census thing in 10 years, right? But no. The questions that will guide our future decisions, the categories that we will have, that we will each have to fit ourselves into, and the mechanisms that will be put in place to preserve the full depth of the data. These will all be shaped by debates, discussions, and proposals taking place in the early years of the 2020s, right now. Dear reader, now is the time for us to start working to achieve a census capable of extending and improving this experiment in democracy, a census that lets us see ourselves and our country clearly enough to face our keenest problems and discover our greatest opportunities in the numbers and beyond them. Thank you so much.
Dan, that is so interesting. It's a real rallying cry for those of us as individuals, but also a rallying cry, to fit in and to be counted. And I really enjoyed your presentation, as did the nearly 600 people that have been on tonight. So thank you so much. And I just want to remind our audiences that copies of Democracy's Data can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Mass. Use the code AMINS22 as you order, and the book you receive will be signed by Dan on a book plate. You will see more information in the chat, and it will also be emailed to you the details of how to get a book as the video link is sent your way in the hours ahead. We at NAHGS are delighted to have presented tonight's event. If you're researching an individual, a family, or a time in history, our library and research center could be very useful. The stacks on Newbury Street in Boston's Back Bay are now open to the public. NAHGS members can delve into our digital archives anytime, gaining access to 1.4 billion searchable family records. Free to the public, you can chat online with one of our genealogists. Our Brew Family Learning Center hosts many educational programs geared to all who are interested in doing research, from those who are new to researching to you pros out there. Join us in September for a 3-week session in getting organized to do research, a course in that. In October, we'll look in depth at navigating our nation's federal records, which is, of course, what the census is. This is an online seminar. We'll also, in October, gather experts to discuss how to uncover hidden histories, the life stories of those left out of written records. We have 3 experts, including a genealogist, on our panel, and we'll get all sorts of tricks from them. You'll find more information and registration at americanancestors.org/events. We'll hope to see you. And for you literary sorts, our virtual author talks continue on. On September 12th, we'll look at the history of our country's national anthem. Don't miss Mark Clegg of University of Michigan's presentation of his new book, Oh, Say Can You Hear? A cultural biography of the Star-Spangled Banner. The book came out earlier this summer and has been heralded coast to coast. Following his illustrated presentation, Mark will talk with Christina R. Gaddy, author of Well of Souls, Uncovering the Banjo's Hidden History. So this will be an American music event as well as an American history event. On September 20, we're hosting another popular writing history discussion featuring the best love historian and prolific author, Eric J. Dolan. Following a presentation about his book, Rebels at Sea, Eric will be in dialogue with an historian well known to NEHGS, William F. Fowler, Professor Emeritus at Northeastern. Together, they'll discuss unsung heroes of the high seas during the American Revolution, and in greater depth, they'll focus on the craft of documenting history. The program's extended time will allow for questions, and a copy of Eric's book comes with your ticket that night. And on September 29, with the GBH Forum Network as our partners, we're looking at the history of clothing, hearing from 2 authors about their research and books, Sophie Thanhauser, who wrote Worn, A People's History of Clothing, and Kimberly Chrisman Campbell, the author of Skirts, Fashioning Modern Femininity in the 20th Century. This expert duo will be joined by moderator Petra Slinkard, curator of fashion and textiles at the Peabody Essex Museum here in Massachusetts. The museum is also partnering in this presentation. It should be a great discussion. And now back to tonight. Our mission at NEHGS is to educate, inspire, and connect. We hope we've accomplished that with tonight's talk, and we do hope you'll come back for more programs. Dan, thank you for all of us from sharing your work. And to our audience, thank you from behind the scenes in Boston and from Hamilton, New York, where the semester has just started at Colgate University. Dan, how lucky we were to be your students today. We wish you a good night. Everyone out there, a glorious end of summer. Take care, all.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.